areas of engineering which we should continue to celebrate.
Substantive question, Minister David Johnson. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions 5 and 6 together. As we turn the tide on COVID-19, I want to make sure the Cabinet Office Equality Hub focuses on the evidence and makes sure that everyone in the UK has their opportunity and doesn't face discrimination or barriers to success.
Go across to David Johnson. David Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for that statement. Does she agree with me that although it's not in the Equality Act, we should have a firm focus on social background and social mobility so that it's not the school you went to, the family you come from or the area you grew up in which determines your life chances?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and we are restructuring the Equalities Hub to also cover areas like social background and geography too. It will put world-class analysis and research at its heart, and I'm proud that both the Department of International Trade and the Equality Hub have both been named as in the top 75 employers in the Social Mobility Employment Index, an organisation which I know my honourable friend established.
We now have the supplementary from Caroline Ansell. Caroline Ansell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Education is, of course, a very key driver of social mobility. You would expect me to say no less as a teacher myself. And would my right honourable friend join me in thanking all the teachers in Eastbourne, teachers and head teachers who are doing such a tremendous job looking after and educating the children of our key workers, most particularly Shinewater Primary School. But can I ask my right honourable friend if she would outline the work of the Equalities Office with the DFE to ensure that those disadvantaged pupils in our schools do not suffer as a result of these very necessary school closures?
Questions. Minister, can you pick out from that? We can't continue. We've got to get through the questions.
Well, I want to put on record my thanks to all the teachers across the country who are doing a brilliant job of keeping our children educated using the latest modern technology. And we're doing all we can to ensure that no child, whatever their background, is left behind during this crisis. We've already committed over 100 million to boost remote learning, and we're funding access to IT devices and software focused on the most disadvantaged.
I will now call Minister Kemi Badenow to answer the substantive question that's been tabled by Patrick Grady. So it's substantive question, Patrick Grady, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A universal basic income is not the best way to deliver social equality because it does not target help to those who need it most. In response to the COVID-19 outbreak, the government set out a substantial package of targeted measures to provide support to people affected by coronavirus, which can be delivered quickly and effectively through existing systems.
And supplementary question from Patrick Grady. Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue is, though, that people are still falling through the cracks. And doesn't she accept that from an equalities perspective, the best way to stop that is to take a universal approach? That's why the First Minister in Scotland has said that increasingly a universal basic income is an idea whose time has come. Instead of ruling it out of hand, will the government not consult with devolved administrations, the All-Party Group and other interested expert organisations to see how a minimum guarantee of income can be weighed to work?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid we disagree on this issue. While we are happy to continue the debate, the fact is that flat rate payments make no allowance for additional help to cope with variable essential living costs. They fail to target those who need support, disabled people, lone parents, and this universal way of providing support is not going to work well within our existing welfare system.
We'll go across to Anne McLaughlin. Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm interested in this outright dismissal of universal basic income and how, where and when this decision was reached. And given that those who will benefit the most from UBI, and contrary to what the Minister's just said, are the very people this department is supposed to be fighting for, can I ask, did the Minister lose the argument, or did she fail in her duty to advise her colleagues what a difference a universal basic income could make to social equality?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure why the Honourable Lady has chosen to take that stance. The fact is there are many, many respected people who think that the universal basic income is not what is right for this country. It lacks the flexibility to respond to changes in income like universal credit. It is less redistributive, and it's certainly not something that we're considering at the moment.
Minister, we have a substantive question from Diane Abbott. Minister.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. We are very concerned by reports of a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on ethnic minorities. It is important that we understand what is underpinning these disparities and that we have robust and accurate data to do so in order to take effective action.
We go across to Diane Abbott. Diane Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware that of the 17 doctors who've died from COVID-19, 16 are from BAME backgrounds. So will she speak to her ministerial colleagues in the Department of Health about the NHS surcharge for migrants? It cannot be right that NHS migrant workers who are frequently BAME pay twice for the NHS, first through taxation, then through the surcharge, and increasingly with their lives.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an issue that I personally have taken a keen interest in, and it's one of the reasons why we've commissioned PHE to review exactly what the impact is on ethnic minorities, specifically on fees for migrants. Migrants who are ordinarily resident in the UK already receive their NHS care for free. Many more are exempt from charges, including temporary migrants who pay the immigration health surcharge and asylum seekers. However, it's important to note that we remain committed to fighting this virus, and that is why we changed our regulations in January to ensure that no overseas visitor or anyone living here would be charged for diagnosis or treatment for COVID.
We go across to Lillian Greenwood. Lillian Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dr. Amir Birni of the Association of Pakistani Physicians of Northern Europe and Dr. Kashif Jahan of the Nottinghamshire Doctors Families Association have both written to me raising concerns about the safety of BAME medical staff. They tell me that their members are scared. NHS trusts have reported problems moving at-risk BAME NHS staff away from the front line of the crisis, despite calls from Public Health England to do so. What discussions has the Minister had with the Secretary of State for Health to ensure that the risk to BAME staff is properly assessed and their health and safety properly protected?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that question. Well, first of all, the Public Health England review is going to look into this specific issue, but I must stress that we are working round the clock to protect everyone, absolutely everyone on the front line during this pandemic for as long as is required. NHS England have sent a letter to those running NHS care organisations recommending that employers should risk assess staff as a precautionary measure to see if they're at greater risk, and if so, put other measures in place to protect them. And that's something that's going to be going on around the country.
We go across to the Chair of the Committee, Caroline Noakes. Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We heard on Monday from the Health Secretary, and my honourable friend, the Minister, has reiterated the importance of robust data. Is my honourable friend confident that the right data is being collected at sufficient pace? And can I ask her specifically what input the GEO is having into the work of Public Health England? And is she confident that we will not only find out why and how BAME communities are affected, but also what needs to be done to protect them?
Minister.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for that question. The Government Equalities Office is refocusing the Equality Hub. The Race Disparity Unit, the Equalities Office and the Disability Unit want to spend more time on research and data so we can help inform government departments in their activity. We want to become more evidence-led. The Public Health England review is something that's going to fit in within this overall strategy. It will be analysing how different factors, including ethnicity, gender, age, can impact on people's health outcomes from COVID-19. And we're confident that this review will be able to analyse available data on health outcomes for NHS staff as well. We expect it to be published at the end of May.
Can I welcome to a new position, the Shadow Minister, Shadow Secretary, Marcia Dickow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The British Medical Association found that BAME doctors have been pushed to the front line of this COVID-19 crisis. and that almost 2/3 of them have felt pressured to work without vital PPE. This comes amidst reports that 72% of all NHS workers' deaths were from a BAME background. Finally, Public Health England last week have asked all NHS trusts to risk assess their BAME staff and, where necessary, remove them from the front line. Can I ask the Minister what steps is her department taking to monitor the impact of this new measure and ensure that no more workers are risking their lives to save lives?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is something that we are keeping a close eye on. We are seeing a disproportionate impact on ethnic minorities, as I mentioned before, but NHS England is the right body to make the decisions on how each and every care organisation should look after their staff. We are not calling for ethnic minority medical staff to be taken off the front line. This will disproportionately impact ethnic minority communities, but we are doing everything we can to ensure that they are protected. And regarding PPE, this is something that we have been, as I said earlier, working round the clock to deliver. We have had over 1 billion items of PPE delivered to health organisations across the country, and we're going to continue to make sure that our frontline staff are very well protected.
We have a substantive question from Mark Harper, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are doing everything we can to ensure no child, whatever their background, falls behind due to coronavirus. We've already committed over £100 million to boost remote learning, and we're funding access to IT devices and software focused on the most disadvantaged. It's worth remembering that schools continue to receive pupil premium funding worth around £2.4 billion annually, and that should help support disadvantaged children during this period.
We go over to Mark Harper. Mark Harper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Minister for that answer, but there is anecdotal evidence that school closures bear down more heavily on those from already disadvantaged backgrounds. So can I ask her, as the government is able to reopen schools, can we look at any measure that's necessary to enable children from more challenged backgrounds to catch up, including, if necessary, weekend and summer schools, even if it's not possible to have schools open fully during those periods, look at what we can do to help?
Minister.
Can I reassure the Right Honourable Gentleman that this is something that we're looking very closely at? We're working with partner organisations, we're exploring targeted support options for disadvantaged pupils while schools remain closed and in the summer break, and we're considering how best to support pupils to rapidly catch up when schools reopen. But he should know that we've already taken prompt, wide-ranging action to help schools and parents support all young people, publishing a list of online education resources for parents, launching a new online academy, and also working with the BBC to create a package of TV and online materials to support learning at home.
Substantive question, Laila Moran, Minister.
As someone who is affected by this issue of ethnic minorities and the disproportionate impact they suffer from COVID, I am glad to see that it's being taken seriously across the House. I am confident that both Parliament and the Health and Social Care Committee will have the opportunity to scrutinise and hold the government to account on this in due course, and this is where cross-party work will be most effective.
Go across to Laila Moran. Laila Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I and the Liberal Democrats welcome this review that Public Health England are undertaking, and I thank the Minister for her response to my question. I hope this means that she will come to the House and make a statement when we finally have the outcome of that review. But there are some things that we can do right now to better understand the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the BAME community. And one of those would be to ask a question on ethnicity on the NHS coronavirus symptom checker to surely give us the data that the review needs. So will the Minister commit to speaking to the Department for Health and Social Care on adding this question to the survey?
I'd like to thank the Honourable Lady for her letter to us on this issue in April. The Health Secretary is aware of it, and I'm sure she'll receive a response from him in due course. But it is important to remember that Public Health England are conducting an independent and expert-led review, and we do trust them to be able to collate the information appropriately as they see fit. Thank you.
Supplementary question from Peterborough. Substantive, Minister.
We know that women are affected by the COVID-19 lockdown in different ways. Women should shoulder greater caring responsibilities and are balancing work with childcare. Some women need immediate access to reproductive and maternity services. They're often financially vulnerable, and financial vulnerability will be exacerbated by this lockdown. So every government department is playing its part in considering how this virus and the lockdown is affecting all of those vulnerable groups of people.
Go over to Peter Bone. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the excellent Minister for that response. Would she agree with me that opening nurseries and at least schools for younger children would be a great benefit, particularly for women?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as a mother with 3 young children aged 6, 3 and 7 months, I can assure you that no one is looking forward to nurseries and primary schools opening more than me. We know that access to childcare is crucial to supporting mothers, particularly single mothers with young children, to return to work when this is possible, and we're working closely with the sector. But schools and other providers will remain closed except for children of critical workers and vulnerable children until the scientific advice indicates it is the right time to reopen.
Substantive question, Shiomara.
Understanding the impacts on different groups and the factors underpinning this is extremely complex, and it is important that we have the right information on which to base our action. That is why, as I mentioned earlier, we have asked Public Health England to review COVID-19 outcomes among different groups and to explore reasons for disparities. And it's also why the government has taken numerous steps to protect those who would be most disadvantaged by this disease.
We go across to Chiomara. Chiomara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But we do have some of that information. According to ONS figures, the coronavirus mortality rate in the most deprived areas, such as Elsick in Newcastle, is more than twice that in the least deprived areas. No doubt a consequence of health inequalities, which we know have risen sharply in the last 10 years. And those on lower incomes are more likely to be in frontline occupations. Now we learn the infection rate in the northeast is the highest in the country. What is the Minister doing to address the disproportionate impact of the virus on BAME and working class communities?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady is right. We are increasingly worried about the number of deaths in deprived areas of the country. The rate of deaths in the most deprived areas, as she says, was more than two times higher than other places. But it is important to note that the factors underlying this are extremely complex. They may be interrelated, but we don't have definitive evidence about the relationship between COVID and deaths in deprived areas. But we are taking many, many steps to look after people from disadvantaged backgrounds, from working class communities. We've protected people's incomes and jobs. We've supported businesses. We've looked at universal credit. We've looked at statutory sick pay. And we're doing every single thing that we can to make sure that individuals and communities are protected on the whole from any adverse impact from the lockdown.
I will now call Minister Victoria Atkins to answer the substantive question tabled by Simon Baines. Victoria Atkins, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I'd like to group questions 17, 18 and 19. We know that lockdown can cause particular pressures for people who are living in abusive households. And this is why the Home Office has launched an awareness campaign and published specific guidance on gov.uk, setting out the support services available to victims. To ensure that these vital services can continue to support victims during lockdown, we have provided an additional £2 million funding to bolster specialist helplines and websites. This is in addition to this.
We're going to have to go across to Simon Baines. Simon Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All domestic abuse is heartbreaking, but particularly for children. What is the government doing for children affected by domestic abuse in my constituency of Clwyd South, the rest of Wales and the rest of the UK?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for raising this question. The Domestic Abuse Bill, which had its second reading last week, requires the Domestic Abuse Commissioner to consider the impact of domestic abuse on children in her work. In addition, the bill includes a new statutory duty on Tier 1 local authorities in England to provide support to victims of domestic abuse and their children within safe accommodation. And last week, I announced £3.1 million in funding for specialist support for children affected by domestic abuse.
We have got the other group questions. I'll go across to Chris Elmore. Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to press the Minister on what she's doing specifically in relation to older people who are victims of domestic abuse. Age UK have recently reported in 2019 that over 280,000 people aged between 60 and 74 experienced domestic abuse in England and Wales. And given government advice both in Wales and across the UK on lockdown positions, it'd be helpful to know what specific support she's doing for people who are older as victims.
Minister.
I thank the honourable member for his question. The gov.uk website sets out, as I say, the services that are available to victims of domestic abuse in these very troubling times. And of course, helplines may be particularly helpful to older people who are not as familiar with online services, perhaps, as younger generations. In addition, we have announced £76 million in funding to help vulnerable people with the Chancellor's £750 million charities fund, and that includes victims of domestic abuse. And of course, the bill itself.
We're having to go over to Marco Longhi. Marco Longhi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Churches Housing Association of Dudley and District is a charity that provides support and housing to vulnerable people, including victims of domestic abuse. Does my honourable friend agree that the recent announcement of £76 million to support such charities and the new priority need status allocated to victims who are seeking local housing will provide very real support to an extremely vulnerable group of people at this difficult time?
Minister Atkins.
I agree with my honourable friend that small and frontline charities play a vital role in supporting vulnerable people, and that's why on Saturday the Community Secretary announced a £76 million fund package of support to ensure that the most vulnerable in society get the support they need during the pandemic.
Going over to Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Disabled women are 3 to 4 times more likely to face domestic abuse than non-disabled women. But accessible specialist services are at most at risk during this coronavirus crisis, with only 1 in 10 refugee spaces being accessible. So as part of the work of the Disability Unit, will the Minister ensure that specialist funding for domestic advice, disabled domestic advice being victims are ring-fenced?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady and I welcome her to her position. We are very, very aware that disabled victims face additional pressures to when they're victims of domestic abuse, and so certainly those considerations form part of the government's plans to help the most vulnerable people in society during these very troubling times.
Order. This Friday marks the 75th anniversary of the Victory in Europe Day. I know all honourable members will be keen to mark this occasion, even in these exceptional circumstances. I will be marking the occasion with the wreath-laying ceremony in the House on Friday. We now come to questions to the Prime Minister. I would like to welcome the Prime Minister back to his rightful place in the Chamber. The whole House and the whole country is delighted at his recovery and welcome back to his elected House. I now call the Prime Minister to answer his engagement question.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for your kind words, and it is good to be back, even though I've been away for longer than I had intended. I would like to pay tribute today to the 107 NHS and 29 care workers and all those who have sadly died from coronavirus. I know that the sympathies of the House are with their family and friends. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, I would like to place on the record in this House my own thanks to all the staff at St Thomas's Hospital for the brilliant care that I received. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I will have further such meetings later today.
I now call Simon Jupp. Simon Jupp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And firstly, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister back to where he belongs. And I'm sure the whole House will join me in congratulating him and his fiancée on the birth of their son, Wilfred. On coronavirus, tourism is absolutely crucial to the economy of the South West, including my constituency of East Devon. While I'm currently asking visitors to come back later once the lockdown has ended, I want to make sure our vital tourism industry survives, so we can be open for business at the earliest opportunity. Can the Prime Minister assure me, my constituents and East Devon's tourism industry that further and flexible financial support is coming to protect this crucial industry?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, I can, and I thank my honourable friend for what he's doing to campaign for tourism in East Devon, and I can tell him that we're adding another 1.3 million to help the tourism industry in that area. Clearly, I think the priority of the government and I believe of the whole House is now to suppress this disease further as we do that, to get our economy going again and to encourage tourism across our whole country and of course East Devon in particular.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister back to his place and say that it's good to see him back in Parliament? I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say that. And although I've done this privately, can I congratulate him publicly with Carrie on the birth of their son? Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister returned to work a week ago Monday, he said that many people were looking at the apparent success of the government's approach. But yesterday we learnt, tragically, that at least 29,427 people in the UK have now lost their lives to this dreadful virus. That's now the highest number in Europe. It's the second highest in the world. That's not success or apparent success. So can the Prime Minister tell us how on earth did it come to this?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, of course, every death is a tragedy, and he's right to draw attention to the appalling statistics, not just in this country, but of course around the world. And I think I would echo really in answer to his question what we've heard from Professor David Spiegelhalter and others, that at this stage, I don't think that international comparisons and the data is yet there to draw the conclusions that we want. What I can tell him is that at every stage as we took the decisions that we did, we were governed by one overriding principle and aim, and that was to save lives and to protect our NHS. And I believe that, of course, there will be a time to look at what decisions we took and whether we could have taken different decisions. But I have absolutely no doubt that what the people of this country want us to do now is, as I said just now, to suppress this disease, to keep suppressing this disease, and to begin the work of getting our country's economy back on its feet. And I look forward to working with him and colleagues around the House to do just that.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the argument that international comparisons can't really be made when the government's been using slides like this for weeks to do international comparison just really doesn't hold water. I'm afraid that many people are concluding that the answer to my question is that the UK was slow into lockdown, slow on testing, slow on tracing, and slow on the supply of protective equipment. And I want to go to yesterday's figures that show that whilst happily in hospitals it looks as though deaths are falling, deaths in care homes continue to go up. At the press conference last night, the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor said, and I quote, "What this shows us is that there's a real issue that we need to get to grips with in relation to what's happening in care homes." I couldn't agree more. But 12 weeks after the Health Secretary declared that we're in a health crisis, I have to ask the Prime Minister, why hasn't the government got to grips with this already?
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, I mean, he's quite right, of course, to look at the crisis in care homes, and he's absolutely right to say that there's an epidemic going on in care homes, which is something I bitterly regret, and we've been working very hard for weeks to get it down, and a huge amount of effort has been gone into by literally tens of thousands of people to get the right PPE to care homes, to encourage workers in care homes to understand what is needed. And I can tell him actually that he's not right in what he just said about the state of the epidemic in care homes. As he looks at the figures, in the last few days, there has been a palpable improvement. We must hope that that continues, and we will ensure that it does continue.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for that. I was using the slide the government put up at its press conference last night, which shows, sadly, that, and I accept there's a lag to the 24th of April because of the reporting position, but that sadly deaths in care homes have been rising every time they've been reported by the ONS. And I have heard before from the First Secretary that numbers were falling. He said that a week ago Sunday. That's not borne out by these slides. We will wait to see what the next slides bring. Mr. Speaker, on the 30th of April, the government claimed success in meeting its 100,000 tests a day target. Since then, as the Prime Minister knows, the number has fallen back. On Monday, there were just 84,000 tests, and that meant 24,000 available tests were not used. What does the Prime Minister think was so special about the 30th of April that meant that testing that day was so high?
Prime Minister.
Well, actually, I think that the right honourable gentleman was right last week when he paid tribute to the amazing work of the NHS, the logistics team, everybody involved in getting up from 2,000 tests a day in March to 120,000 by the end of April. And yes, he's right that capacity currently exceeds demand. We're working on that. We're running at about 100,000 a day. But the ambition clearly is to get up to 200,000 a day by the end of this month, and then to go even higher. And as he knows and the whole House will know, testing, a fantastic testing regime is going to be absolutely critical to our long-term economic recovery.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I did pay tribute last week, and I'm glad the Prime Minister has now said that the target now is 200,000 tests a day by the end of this month. But of course, just having a target isn't a strategy. What is needed is testing, tracing and isolation. That's the strategy. Contact tracing was happening in the UK, but it was abandoned in mid-March. We were told at the time that this was because it was, quote, not an appropriate mechanism. But yesterday, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer said it was to do with testing capacity. So can the Prime Minister just clarify the position for us? Why was contact tracing abandoned in mid-March and not restarted sooner?
Prime Minister.
As I think is readily apparent, Mr. Speaker, to everybody who's studied the situation, and I think as the scientists would confirm, the difficulty in mid-March was that the tracing capacity that we had and that had been useful, as he rightly says, in the containment phase of the epidemic, that capacity was no longer useful or relevant since the transmission from individuals within the UK meant that it exceeded our capacity then. Now, the value of the test tracking and tracing operation that we're setting up now is that as we come out of the epidemic and as we get the new cases down, we will have a team that will genuinely be able to track and trace hundreds of thousands of people across the country and thereby to drive down the epidemic. And so, I mean, to put it in a nutshell, it's easier to do now that we've built up the team on the way out than it was as the epidemic took off. And I think most people with common sense can see those particular difficulties that we had at the time.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Prime Minister has confirmed it was a capacity problem. Can I wish the government well on the tracking and tracing now and on the app that's being trialled in the Isle of Wight? We all want that to succeed, and we'll all support that in hopefully succeeding. Can I turn to protective equipment, where clearly there are ongoing problems? Just this week, the BMA survey said that 48% of doctors had to buy their protective equipment for themselves or rely on donations. That's clearly unacceptable. And it's obvious that this problem is going to get even more acute if and when the government asks people to return to work. We're clearly going to need a very robust national plan for protective equipment. Can the Prime Minister reassure the public that they won't be asked to return to work until that plan is in place?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I certainly can. And I share his frustration about PPE and the frustration that I think people have felt across the House and across the country. It's been enraging to see the difficulties that we've had in supplying PPE to those who need it. But I do pay tribute, again, to the work of hundreds of thousands of people involved in the logistics of supplying literally billions of items across the country in a timely way. There have been no national stockouts of any PPE item, and we are now engaged in a massive plan to ramp up domestic supply, and he'll be familiar with what Lord Dighton is now at work, so that, to get to his final question, we are able, in the long term, and it may be the long term, to satisfy the domestic needs of this country.
Keir Starmer.
And we will, of course, be setting out the details about that plan on Sunday.
Keir Starmer again.
Mr. Speaker, I was going to come to the plan. I'm grateful to the Prime Minister for that indication. There are millions of people on furlough, as the Prime Minister knows, millions with children at home struggling with caring responsibilities. If they're to return to work, and if their children are to return to school, they need reassurance. I think we can all feel that, reassurance that it'll be safe to do so. And that means they do need to know what the government's plan is for the next stage. So will the Prime Minister give them that reassurance by setting out his plan as he says he will? Or will he come to this House on Monday to present that plan and have questions across the House?
Mr. Speaker, I will of course undertake that there will be a statement to the House, as you, Mr. Speaker, and the House would properly expect about what we propose tonight. I just want to explain to the House as a courtesy why it's happening on Sunday, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure you'd be interested to know that. The reason for that is very simple, that we have to be sure that the data is going to support our ability to do this. But that data is coming in continuously over the next few days. We'll want, if we possibly can, to get going with some of these measures on Monday. I think it would be a good thing, Mr. Speaker, if people had an idea of what's coming the following day. That's why I think Sunday, the weekend, is the best time to do it. But of course, the House will be fully informed, and the House will have the full opportunity to debate and interrogate me or the government on that matter.
And hopefully in the future it will be to the House first. Teresa Villiers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lockdown rules permit people to travel to work if their jobs are not ones that can be done from home. But some have faced criticism and pressure not to do that, including from announcements on London Underground wrongly saying they shouldn't be on the system unless they're key workers. Will the Prime Minister ask the Mayor to restore public transport capacity in London so my constituents can travel safely and we can keep as much of the economy going as possible?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend, and she's absolutely right that a crucial part of our success now in getting transport to run safely will be running a bigger and more expansive tube service so that people can observe social distancing. We will certainly be working with the Mayor to try to achieve that, though there must be, and we'll come to this on Sunday and next week as well, Mr. Speaker, that there must be mitigations to help people who, for the reasons of social distancing, cannot use mass transit. And there will be a huge amount of planning going into helping people to get to work other than by mass transit. And this will be, I hope, I know that my right honourable friend will, as a former Secretary of State for Transport, will agree, this is, or should be, a new golden age for cycling.
We now go across to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to start by welcoming the Prime Minister back to Parliament and congratulating him and Carrie on the birth of their son Wilfred, and I, of course, wish Wilfred every health and happiness. Mr. Speaker, the UK's confirmed death toll now stands at close to 30,000. It is officially the highest in Europe and the second highest in the entire world, and indeed there are some estimates putting the figure even higher. And in my own community of Skye, we've faced our own heartbreaking and devastating outbreak of COVID-19 over the last few days. I do agree with the Prime Minister when he says the worst thing that we could do now is ease up the lockdown too soon and allow for a second peak of this deadly virus. To protect our citizens, the lockdown must remain in place for as long as it's needed. Well, many people might want to travel, for example, to the tourist areas during the better weather. Will he join with me in reminding everyone that non-essential travel is not permitted? And does he agree with me that the First Minister of Scotland and our approach should be only led by the best medical and scientific advice, not the politics of posturing?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. And actually, I think that the last few weeks have shown the ability of the governments of all four nations to come together and to deliver very clear messages for our people, and I think it's been extremely helpful. I think the collaboration has been extremely helpful, and I can say to the leader of the SNP that we will certainly be working with the government in Scotland, as we will be working with the opposition, with unions, with business, to make sure that we get the unlockdown plan completely right. And you know what he says is absolute common sense. It would be an economic disaster for this country if we were to pursue a relaxation of these measures now in such a way as to trigger a second spike. And on that point, I'm in complete agreement with him.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful for the Prime Minister's answer, and I commit myself and my party and my government colleagues in Edinburgh and working with them on that shared agenda. However, some of his own government ministers are not following his own advice. Instead of working with the Scottish Government, the Scottish Secretary of State has been making political arguments about the Constitution rather than scientific ones about saving lives. And he's not the only one. This is not the time for opportunistic politicking. This is the time when we all must work together to protect our NHS and to save lives. We anticipate the Prime Minister will be making a televised address on Sunday concerning the easing of lockdown. This cannot be undertaken without the full input and cooperation of all our devolved governments. We must end this period of mixed messaging from the UK Government. Will the Prime Minister commit today that the substance of his address will be fully agreed to with the devolved nations so that all of our governments continue with this vitally important work of saving lives?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, I forgot to thank the Right Honourable Gentleman and other colleagues for his kind words about Wilfred, and I just want to thank him for that, because I forgot to say that. I'll be marked down if I don't. So thank you. And I share the Right Honourable Gentleman's aims. We will do our level best to make sure that the outlines of this attract the widest possible consensus. I think that they can and ought to, and I'm delighted by his call for a prohibition, and I quote, on political arguments about the Constitution, and I think that would be warmly welcomed across this country.
We go across to Andrew Bowie. Andrew Bowie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I add my welcome to the Prime Minister. It's great to see him back in his place, and add my congratulations to those of others, to himself and Carrie, on the birth of Wilfred. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend will know that the oil and gas industry is suffering from a perfect storm at the present time, buffeted as it is by the global oil price crash and the lockdown. This is a moment of real danger for the industry, with the prospect of tens of thousands of job losses unless action is taken. Tax incentives and investment by this party over the last decade have, of course, been welcome, but more action is needed now to protect jobs, ensure energy security, and ensure a future for this industry, which is key to delivering net zero by 2050. So can my right honourable friend promise to bring forward the oil and gas sector deal as soon as possible and commit the UK government to investing in a transition part in the northeast of Scotland, ensuring a future for thousands of workers
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend very much for his excellent question, for all his campaigning for the oil and gas industry. The whole House will have heard the fervour and learning with which he speaks on that issue, and I can assure him that our right honourable colleague, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth, is actively engaged right now in pursuing this with the Sector Trade Association, and I'm sure he'll be wanting to take up progress with him.
Going across to Mike Amesbury. Mike Amesbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the Prime Minister back to his place on my birthday. Bolton and Cheshire West and Chester councils covering my constituency have stepped up to the national challenge, providing essential services to vulnerable residents and businesses during this crisis. The government promised to do whatever it takes and fully compensate those councils and councils across the country. Yet both are millions of pounds short of the cost so far, billions nationally. How will the Prime Minister fulfil that funding promise and not return to the dark days of austerity?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can certainly tell him that the government has absolutely no intention of returning to the A word, which I won't quote. That is not going to be our approach. We don't think that is going to be necessary. What I can tell him is that we already put another 3.2 billion, as he knows, into supporting local authorities, supporting some of the most vulnerable throughout this difficult time, and we will continue to make sure that funding gets through to those who need it. But the crucial thing, as I think colleagues across the House will understand, is that the more effectively we can suppress this virus and the faster we can restart our economy, the better our chances, as everybody knows, of getting the funding that we all need to the poorest and neediest in our society. And that's the course this government is going to follow.
We'll go across to Raymond Chistey. Raymond Chistey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like other colleagues, I'm absolutely delighted to see the Prime Minister back at the dispatch box and congratulating him and Carrie on the birth of their child. Prime Minister, my constituent, Jackie Potter, recently lost her husband, Ashley, who was 64. The family would like to bury Ashley with a small church service, applying social distancing. If Ashley were to be cremated, this would happen. But as he is being buried, under current guidelines, that is not possible. Can this anomaly between burials and cremations be urgently addressed so that families of all faiths who want to bury their loved ones, applying social distancing and in a faith service, are able to do so?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my honourable friend and I extend my deepest sympathies to the friends and family of his constituent, Ashley. And we're asking councils to do exactly that, to help people to attend without breaching the rules on social distancing. And I'm sure he'd appreciate we think that's the right balance to strike.
We go across to Justin Mathers. Justin Mathers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Undoubtedly, the furlough scheme has prevented mass unemployment. But when companies like BA use millions of pounds of public money to furlough those staff at the same time as handing out redundancy notices, it's a kick in the teeth to both those workers and the taxpayer. And it's concerning that reports today suggest the furlough scheme may be wound down after June. So, Prime Minister, wouldn't it be an obscenity, either through employer decisions or government inaction, if those people whose jobs we've been trying to save end up redundant anyway?
Can I just say, before the Prime Minister answers, please will members ensure they don't have political slogans behind them when they are speaking. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think actually the furlough scheme has been one of the outstanding provisions that this government's been able to put in. I think it's given huge numbers of people, more than 6 million people in this country, the security that they need. Obviously, what we want is to make sure that people continue to feel security, but at the same time, what we also want is to enable people safely and securely to go back to work and to earn their pay packets as they want to do.
Ben Bradley.
Mr. Speaker, can I add my welcome and congratulations to my honourable friend and ask him if he agrees with me that our FE and HE institutions have a huge role to play in rebuilding our economy, and particularly in supporting and retraining those who have lost their jobs. Has he considered what they might offer and indeed how we might incentivise them to offer the right qualifications and support, particularly for businesses and new entrepreneurs?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, I think my friend very much for all the work he does to champion the cause of education, particularly further education on the Education Select Committee. As he knows, the agenda of this government remains unchanged, to unite and level up across our country with infrastructure, technology, education above all, and that includes our world-leading universities, which are now formulating vaccines against this disease, and of course further education, the skills that our economy is going to need so badly for a sustained economic recovery.
We go across to Murray Black. Murray Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the government are refusing to even discuss universal basic income, I was glad to see them at least recognise the need for an increase in universal credit entitlement. However, there's been no such increase announced in employment support allowance. So I want to ask the Prime Minister what plans he has for a similar increase in ESA, and if not, can he explain why he feels people who are sick or have a disability require less support at this time?
Prime Minister.
As she knows, what we have done is remove the 7-day waiting time for ESA, and I'm glad, though, that she pays tribute to the big increase in universal credit, another £1,040, benefiting 4 million families across this country, a total investment of £7 billion. I think what everybody wants to see is not just people taking universal credit, but as I've said now several times, what they want to see is a careful, sensible programme attracting the widest possible support to continue to suppress the disease right down, but to allow our economy to start up again.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been very impressed by how businesses and individuals across my constituency have been buying and lending devices so children can learn at home during this pandemic. This initiative will obviously be significantly enhanced by the £100 million given by the Education Secretary recently. But the member for Harlow, the chair of the Education Select Committee, has suggested that when schools do go back, a catch-up premium should be brought in to close the gap between those most disadvantaged and left behind and their peers who are better off. Constituencies like Barrow, this will make all the difference as we rebuild. Will you commit to such a scheme?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend and I congratulate him on the way he's representing his constituents in Barrow. He's exactly right. That's why, amongst other things, we are ensuring that there are extra computers and laptops for disadvantaged communities. We're making sure that we supply them with more 4G routers, invaluable at this particularly difficult time. And there will be more to come, Mr. Speaker, because this is a government that is going to pursue our agenda of uniting and levelling up across the whole of the UK.
Go across to David Linden. David Linden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the government lowered the benefit cap threshold in 2015, it's been frozen, which is essentially a real terms cut every year to those it affects. Now, CPAG, the Resolution Foundation, and the IFS are just some of the voices calling on the government to remove the cap as part of its coronavirus response. And we know that 93% of those households affected by the cap have children, and it's ultimately those children that are losing out from this policy. So will the Prime Minister do the right thing and scrap the cap?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I've just told the House, I think he asked for lifting the cap on benefits, and as I've just told the House, there's already a total of £7 billion extra that's gone into universal credit alone.
Go across to Rob Butler. Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are very dark and difficult days, but can I highlight the amazing work that's being done by volunteers across the country to help others? In my own constituency, there are dedicated groups delivering groceries and prescriptions from Stoke-on-Church to Bedgrove, from Hewenden to Berryfields. I wonder if my right honourable friend would join me in thanking them all, but perhaps especially congratulating the organisers of Bernie the Bus, which, whilst it collects food for the food bank, plays very loud party music out of the back, bringing a real note of joy and happiness to the local communities as it performs a valuable public service.
Prime Minister.
Well, as a thank you, I thank my honourable friend, and as a great believer in buses and part-time manufacturer, can I agree very strongly with him about the good work done by Bernie the bus and all who support it and travel therein.
We now come to the final question from Lillian Greenwood. Lillian Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Community Secretary has rightly recognised that council workers are the unsung heroes of this crisis and promised to give local authorities the resources they need. But my city faces a gap of up to £55 million as a result of extra costs and lost income. Our communities bore the brunt of austerity. They cannot carry the burden of coronavirus. Will he give all councils a cast iron guarantee that they won't be asked to do so?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her very much, and she's absolutely right, as anybody knows, to draw attention to the difficulties, the straitened circumstances, the pressures that local councils have been under, and that's why we put the extra 3.2 billion in immediately to help them cope. And she should know, by the way, that Nottingham, her own city, has already had an extra 19 million to help deal with the pressures of coronavirus, and certainly that is by no means the last of the support that we will be giving to our fantastic frontline council workers who, as she rightly says, have borne so much of the brunt in this crisis.
We now come to the urgent question to Secretary of State for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy. I call Minister Scully to answer the urgent question from Andy MacDonald as on the order paper. The Minister should speak for no more than 3 minutes. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to answer the question. We've made clear that there are 5 tests that the government will need to be satisfied of before we will consider it safe to adjust the current measures. As honourable members will be aware, the government's in the process of consulting with businesses, business representative organisations and trade unions on the issue of safer working in a COVID-19 context. We want workers in our country to feel confident that they're returning to a safe workplace. So we're working with Public Health England, the Health and Safety Executive, and with 525 stakeholders in total in detail, the vast majority of which are represented across all parts of the United Kingdom. This includes 9 unions and over 400 businesses. We're grateful for all the feedback and the constructive way in which it's been provided. Mr. Speaker, our guidelines will be published in due course.
I now call Andy MacDonald, who is asked to speak for no more than 2 minutes. I go across to Andy MacDonald. Andy MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, last Sunday, the government sent trade unions and businesses 7 consultation documents outlining proposals for a return to workplaces. We all share a common objective of a safe return to work at the appropriate time that protects public health. However, when the government's plans fall short, it's our duty to say so. Trade unions were given just 12 hours to respond. The documents were not shared with the opposition, and the proposals themselves are wholly inadequate. No worker should have their life or the lives of their loved ones risked simply by going to work. This is a legal right which held true before this crisis and crucially must not be cast aside now. The documents present measures to maintain safe workplaces such as hand washing and social distancing as being at the discretion of employers when in fact they are requirements of the law. The government must make this clear and inform workers and businesses of their respective rights and duties. I share the surprise of trade unions that the documents provide no recommendations on PPE, without which it's impossible to make judgments on safe working practices. Critically, the proposals exclude workers. A safe return to work is a significant challenge that can only be met if government and business work with staff. My ask of the Minister is that the government now brings forward guidelines requiring specific COVID-19 risk assessments for most businesses, that assessments are made public and registered with the Health and Safety Executive. And given the lack of capacity for inspections, these assessments must be agreed with staff. In workplaces with trade unions, this can be done by health and safety reps. In those without, the government should enable trade unions to assist workforces in their sectors to elect or appoint a rep to be consulted and involved in the settling implementation and enforcement of assessments. And finally, workers need to have confidence and trust that the government has got their back. So will the Minister confirm that employees will not be prejudiced in any way for drawing attention to safety failings in the workplace? Mr. Speaker, this time we are truly all in this together. I trust that my comments are received in the constructive spirit in which they are offered.
Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for the constructive way that we've began our relationship as opposite numbers in a call that we had last week. I think we have plenty of opportunity to work together in order to bring the confidence that employers, employees and customers need to have as we begin to open up the economy. The guidelines, the draft guidelines that the honourable member was talking about, gentleman was talking about, is an early draft. We've had plenty of opportunity, and we will continue to have plenty of opportunity for the honourable gentleman to feed in, as we have for those 400 businesses and those 9 trade unions, to continue to feed in, because this is not a finished process at the moment. What we need to do is get into the technical detail to make sure that everybody has confidence. In the same way that employees need to have confidence, they should be able to discuss with their employers the steps that they might take to make their workplace safer themselves, and especially when we do start to lift restrictions. Where workers still feel unsafe, though, they can contact their health and safety executive or their local authority, and where that health and safety identifies employers, they can take action to comply with the relevant public health legislation and guidance.
I now call Andrea Ledson. Andrea Ledson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that my honourable friend's department is undertaking a review of corporate governance and audit. Does he agree with me that now more than ever, it's vital that the review puts the safety and the financial security of employees at the heart of all business obligations to their stakeholders?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful for that question. As my right honourable friend knows, we've had 3 independent reviews on various aspects of audit by Sir John Kingsman, the CMA and Sir Donald Bryden, and we are committed to acting on their recommendations, including legislating to create a tougher, stronger regulator as soon as parliamentary time allows. We're working on that, and we'll publish our proposals in due course.
I now call Drew Hendry, who is asked to speak for no more than 1 minute. Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the social and economic impact of this crisis cannot be underestimated, it's vital that all workplaces are reopened only when it's safe to do so. After all, they will only work if they have the confidence of workers. On the 25th of March, the Scottish Government and the STUC made a joint statement making clear their shared fair work expectations. That naturally followed their fair work approach, which has been developed in partnership with unions over years, and they're now looking forward to putting that into law once Holyrood has the power to do so. So reports that the TUC cannot support the draft UK policies are therefore of great concern. In a spirit of collegiality, what consideration is given of the following the Scottish Government's approach of ensuring that guidance is consistent with fair work, including that workplace rules be developed for specific environments, not only by employers, but by trade unions as well?
Minister.
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman's comments on that, and I agree with him that our message and our processes need to be as consistent as possible, not least for people across the UK, but for those companies that operate in each of the nations in the UK as well. And so that's why colleagues from my department have regular conversations with the devolved administrations, including the Scottish Parliament, and we must make sure that we are continuing to work to get into the detail, to give employees the confidence. So we will continue to work through with those businesses, with those unions, but also other people who are feeding in on a day-to-day basis, so that we can come up with a consistent, robust line that will give confidence and will show the examples, the businesses that are remaining open now, that we can learn from their best practice.
Go across to Lucy Allen. Lucy Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Enabling people to go back to work safely is key to getting through this crisis. Safe working will inevitably be different for different businesses and different settings. Will the Minister do all he can to ensure that government guidance focuses on general principles of social distancing and hygiene and avoids being overly prescriptive so that as many businesses as possible can reopen safely?
Minister.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend for that question, and she's absolutely right that this is why we've consulted as widely as possible, and we continue to do so, because we need to make sure that all of these guidelines give people in every type of workplace, every part of the country, every part of the UK, that sense of confidence. And I think it's really important to reiterate the fact that there are many, many companies still operating now, and we do need to make sure our economy stays opening and working so that we can bounce back as possible. And those companies are already offering best practice.
Go across to Sarah Olney. Sarah Olney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been speaking to lots of businesses over the last few days, and they're all obviously very keen to get back to work as soon as possible. But their big concern is the safety of their staff, but also what liability would the businesses have to bear on behalf of those staff if one of them got sick despite their best efforts to ensure their safety. And I'd really like to hear what the Minister has to say to give businesses reassurance on that point.
Minister.
Well, as I say, what I would say in the first instant to the Honourable Lady is that as well as employers working on that guidance and making sure that they're offering a safe place, employees and workers need to know that they have the right and the opportunity to approach the Health and Safety Executive, to approach local authorities, to make sure that existing legislation and that guidance is being followed.
We go across to Andrew Selous. Andrew Selous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And if we want businesses to come back, they need to survive. And small businesses who pay themselves through dividends are not pariahs. They operate entirely legally. Will my honourable friend speak to the Treasury to make sure that these businesses do survive? Can we look again at the dividend issue, because many small businesses may not survive, to allow their workers to come back next week if we don't?
Minister.
Thank you. I'm grateful for that comment. The government's first priority clearly is saving lives with all of this, but livelihoods and making sure businesses and jobs are retained and that we're able to bounce back is very, very important. So I will certainly take that away. And I know the Treasury have always been keen to look at each step of this situation to make sure that we can come up with economic support as well as the health support that we've been discussing within this urgent question.
We go across to North Antrim to Ian Paisley. Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and indeed welcome to North Antrim. Can the Minister tell us what guidelines will he put in place and the government put in place to assist necessary workers and passengers travelling from Northern Ireland to London on airlines? What assistance will he put in place to air operators taking and making necessary flights to ensure that there is the necessary guidelines and protections in place for those workers?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that, honourable gentleman for that question. And in part of giving confidence to people to return to work, clearly it is also important to give people the confidence to be able to travel to and from various parts of the UK in order to work as well. And that's why this process will also look at transport. It will look at this at opening of schools and these kind of things when the guidance, the health guidance, suitably is appropriate.
We go across to Jane Stevenson. Jane Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to all the people who've been working throughout the pandemic to allow us to stay at home. Many people in Wolverhampton are now nervous of returning to the workplace, especially those who share their home with a medically vulnerable person. Will special advice be given to employers or extra measures be put in place so that these people can be confident that they're continuing to protect and shield vulnerable people?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising that really important issue of those people that are most vulnerable in this situation. Existing guidance already sets out the steps which individuals who are living with shielding and vulnerable people should take to keep them safe. Where the Health and Safety Executive identifies employers not taking appropriate action to ensure workers in the shielded category can follow the NHS advice to self-isolate for the period specified, they will consider taking a range of actions to improve the control of risks in the workplace.
Go across to Maria Riedel. Maria Riedel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree that to prevent a second wave of COVID-19, employees will have to be as safe as possible when they return to the workplace, that employers have a statutory obligation to achieve this and owe their employers a duty of care? So how can asking employers merely to consider non-binding guidance possibly help them achieve these legal obligations? And is he really saying that workplaces should continue to operate where safe working practices cannot be achieved, as this guidance seems to be saying this?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for that question. What we have been doing by consulting as many businesses as we can, as many unions and representative organisations as we can, is to be able to work through the guidelines in our own time where we were having to react to the closure of the economy at the beginning. This timeline is for us to be able to be well prepared to give few surprises to business as well, so that they can plan. And that's why we want to work and have a flexible situation for them to be able to prepare and operate a safe environment for their employees. But as I mentioned before, employees can approach the Health and Safety Executive or their local authorities if they feel that they're not operating in a safe workplace.
Go across to Mike Wood. Mike Wood. Sorry about this, we're having to go across to Sharon Hodgson. Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree that a public information campaign is required before and during the easing of lockdown that would then inform employees and employers of their respected rights and duties and would give the public confidence in the returning to work?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for that question. And communication is so important in this. We've seen how effective the message has been so far in order to stay at home and save lives. What we now need to do is work with businesses to make sure that they have had the message fully communicated, what the safe guidelines are for their workplaces. But similarly for employees, we need to make it clear, as we're doing now, that those people that cannot work from home, unless they are in a business that has specifically been asked to close, they can travel to work, but they need to be considerate about that, and they need to be making sure that they're working within safe social distancing rules. So yes, communication is everything, and I think we all have a responsibility to get those messages across.
Go across to Scott Benton in sunny Blackpool. Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my honourable friend agree with me that it is vital that people are protected when they return to work? And as we now move to this second phase, will the government commit to providing clear and concise guidance to employers on how they can best protect their staff?
Minister.
Thank my honourable friend for that question. The government remains committed to supporting business during this unprecedented change. We're preparing for the next phase of tackling COVID-19 in the ways that I've outlined, and how we can lift the social distancing measures in a phased way, at the right time, guided by the science. We're involving Public Health England and the Health and Safety Executive to ensure that we have the latest guidance in which to base our planning.
We go to Alison Thewlis. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the first 2 weeks of lockdown, I had many constituents who got in touch, fearful of speaking out against their irresponsible employers in case doing so would get them the sack. So does he understand why Francis O'Grady of the TUC has raised concerns that unless the government shifts position and puts this in law, that bad bosses will continue to expose their workers and all of us to infection without fear of consequences? Will he work with the TUC to put these concerns in law so workers can have that their rights respected and their safety assured?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for that question. I work with and speak to the trade unions on a regular basis. Indeed, I'll be speaking to representatives of the TUC later on this afternoon, and which is why we wanted to keep them involved in forming the guidelines and working with and representing their employees, because that's how by us all working together, we're going to give employees the confidence, and we're going to get the message across to employers that social distancing within the workplace, where possible, is absolutely crucial if we're going to open the economy and be able to return to whatever the new normal is.
We go across to Dusrat Ghani. Dusrat Ghani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The vast majority of businesses in my constituency of Wilden and across the country want to do the right thing. And the right thing is to get back to business. Does my honourable friend agree with me that we should encourage a return to work, of course safely? This is the reason why the SMEs are the backbone of our country, and they deserve even more support now.
Minister. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that question, and she's absolutely right to be standing up for small businesses. And this is why we've said within all of this that if a business, unless it's in one of those areas that are required to close, they can continue to operate so that they're in the best place to survive and bounce back after this situation has completed, and will contribute to the UK's recovery from this situation. But we need to make sure that we can do that safely. We need to make sure that employers are acting responsibly, and that will be dealt with through this, involving as many people as we can in getting those specific guidelines for each different workplace, each part of the UK, and getting those messages across.
We go across to Peter Kyle. Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplies of PPE are still extremely tightly constrained. When employers start to buy face masks and other equipment to keep their employees safe, what is government doing to make sure that the price of PPE and the supply of PPE is not going to be extremely distorted?
Mr. Speaker, I think what we are doing is we're working with supply chains within the UK and indeed across the world to make sure that within the huge demand that there is for PPE from a number of different countries who are each suffering the same situation and working through the same situation together, we can be at the forefront of that. And I know that with the work that my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, is doing, and my colleagues in Bay's department, along with Lord Dighton, we'll be able to ensure that the supply chains remain readily available, and in that way we can also work on a fair pricing.
We now go across to Dean Russell. Dean Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend works with the Prime Minister on the comprehensive plan for the next phase of the response to coronavirus, can he please assure me that we will continue to work with both Public Health England and the Health and Safety Executive to make sure workplaces are safe, but in particular have a focus on complex workplaces like construction sites, where our incredibly hard-working construction workers are having to go into and work, and I just want to make sure that they are safe on site in those sorts of environments. Thank you.
Minister. Grateful to my honourable friend for that question, and he's absolutely right. When he takes that one specific example of construction sites, clearly there are different types. There's Battersea Power Station, which I visited just before these restrictions were put on, which is 40 acres, and so it's comparatively easy to be socially distancing on that site than it is on a far smaller constrained site. But that's why we are bringing together industry expertise, union expertise, representatives of businesses as well, to make sure that we can have guidance that fits as many different workplaces as possible, backed up by Public Health England and the Health Executive and Safety Executive.
We now go across to Dan Jarvis in Yorkshire. Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Analysis from the TUC shows that workplace inspections have fallen by 70% and prosecutions by 82% over the past 10 years. We all want to get Britain back to work. So what guarantees can the Minister give that local government and the Health and Safety Executive will have the resources they need to ensure safe working practices?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for that question, and with regard to the Health and Safety Executive, clearly we will continue to talk to them about the resources that they need, and with regard to local authorities have been working incredibly hard both on local health issues, but also from my experience, and I've spoken to many of them, of getting that financial support out to them as well. And that's why the Chancellor has been giving the financial support with a second round of £1.6 billion to support their functions as well. We will continue to look under, to be under review any support that we need to give.
We now go across to Peter Aldis. Peter Aldis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that holiday parks, campsites and self-catering holiday accommodation are well suited to adhering to workplace safety arrangements and should be considered for phased and gradual reopening so as to boost coastal and rural economies and to provide people with the opportunity of a holiday in the UK?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I'm glad he's standing up for the coastal areas who have been particularly badly affected with all of the sectors within around hospitality, leisure, and some retail. I get a lot of feedback from the economic point of view from those sectors, and we do work closely with them. We will continue to work closely with them, but I will make sure that we pay due attention to all of that advice to make sure all of the coastal areas are well looked after as best we can.
We go up to Manchester to Afzal Khan. Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know it is vital to get the economy moving again. However, this will only be possible when people have the confidence to return to work in the knowledge that their workplace are safe. So why was it that the government proposed non-binding guidance with zero enforcement mechanism? And does the minister think this is sufficient to make people feel safe and confident enough to return to work?
Minister.
We're working with the guidance with a number of business representative organisations and with the trade unions. And when we have that, when it's the appropriate moment to complete that work, we will publish that work. But the Health and Safety Executive will be right at the core of that in checking and enforcing. And as I say, workers will be able to approach both the Health and Safety Executive and local authorities if they do not feel that they are working within an organisation that's adhering to that guidance.
We now go across to Laura Trott. Laura Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of our essential workers are, of course, already in the workplace, for which we are hugely grateful. The Minister confirmed that we will learn from them, but can he also assure the House that we will manage any disruption to them as a result of other sectors going back to work in terms of PPE and also transport requirements?
Minister.
I can assure my honourable friend that we will indeed look at all of this in the round to make sure that we can work out the different scenarios as people return to work. That what we have at the moment is a very different situation to what we have when restrictions may start to open, is a very different situation to what might be when it's fully open. We have to keep that absolutely in our understanding, and we'll work with those people at work that are working still now, but also the other business representative organisations that I mentioned earlier.
We're going to try and reconnect with Mike Wood down in Dudley. Mike Wood, hope you're connected.
Thank you. Second time lucky, Mr. Speaker, although some would prefer me on mute, I'm sure. As the Minister will know, many of our workers have been working throughout this outbreak, as well as thanking them for all of their efforts. Will the Minister assure us that the government is making sure that employers are aware of their responsibilities and keeping their workers safe?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that, and I thank him for the opportunity to say thank you to those people who have kept our economy going through this difficult time. We rightly say a massive thank you to our key workers, our emergency workers, including especially in the NHS. But we must also thank those people that have been feeding the country, that have been supplying those shops, the delivery drivers, the construction workers, the warehouse operatives, as well as those retailers who have been out there doing absolutely crucial work. But we must make sure, as I said earlier, that we can give employees coming back to the workplace the confidence that they're working in a safe environment, and we will certainly do that if we can continue to work with as many businesses, as many unions and as many organisations as possible to get this absolutely right and to get our message right that the economy can be open and we need to get back to work.
Thank you, Minister. We're now going to come on to a statement on the international COVID-19 response. So I will be calling the Secretary of State for International Development to make a statement, who should speak for no more than 10 minutes. So I now call the Secretary of State, Anne-Marie Trevelyan. Anne-Marie Trevelyan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'd like to update the House on the UK support for the global effort to tackle the coronavirus pandemic. The world is now having to address the biggest threat that it's faced in decades, an invisible killer on a global scale. Here in the UK, communities across the country are united in their determination to beat it, making their own personal sacrifices by staying at home, protecting our NHS and saving lives. But there is a daunting outlook for countries in the developing world, simultaneously facing a health crisis, a humanitarian crisis and the risk of a protracted economic crisis leading to much greater hardship for years to come. The threat of famines, exacerbated by the worst locust plague for 70 years, fragile healthcare systems that enable the spread of the disease, and economic disruptions risk a much longer and harder road back to recovery than for wealthy countries. However, through the altruism of the British people and the expertise of our scientists and engineers, the UK is proudly playing a leading role in the global response. On Monday, together with other world leaders, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, co-hosted a virtual global coronavirus response pledging conference. He called on countries around the world to step up their efforts and work together on this, the most urgent shared endeavour of our lifetimes. World leaders responded and some £6.5 billion was pledged for the COVID-19 response, including the UK's own £388 million commitment for vaccines, tests and treatments. The UK is proud to stand with our international partners. This is a truly global effort, and the only way to fight this pandemic is together. So, Mr. Speaker, the UK is an international development superpower, and we are also a scientific and medical world leader. This enables our response to this global pandemic to be greater than the sum of its parts. From Gloucestershire's Dr. Jenner, who laid the foundations for immunology, to our researchers who developed vaccines for measles and Ebola, the UK has led the scientific response to many global health challenges in the past. And I am so proud to be able to say that UK-based scientists, such as those at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, are playing key roles in the global response to this deadly new virus. Scientists in Bedfordshire who developed rapid diagnostic devices to manage the recent Ebola outbreak, funded with taxpayers' money through UK aid, are using that expertise to develop new rapid diagnostic tests. Researchers at Oxford University, funded through CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, are now progressing to clinical trials with funding from the UK Government's Vaccines Task Force, which is also funding a vaccine trial starting soon at Imperial College. In partnership with a British success story, AstraZeneca, one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, our Oxford researchers are working towards their vaccine being manufactured at scale. We know that any vaccine might prove to be the solution, so through our DFID aid budget, the UK is the largest single contributor by any country to CEPI's international efforts to find a vaccine. Through this fund, we are working to improve our understanding of the virus and to support scientists around the globe. CEPI is already backing 9 potential vaccines. Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary outlined at the launch of the WHO Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator that the UK is proud to work with our international partners to ensure new vaccines are accessible to everyone and as quickly as possible. No one will be safe until we are all safe, Mr. Speaker, so we will need vaccines against this deadly disease at home and abroad. Once a vaccine is found, delivering it globally will be the next big challenge. To help that, we have invested the equivalent of £330 million a year for the next 5 years in Gavi, the global vaccine alliance that delivers vaccines in 68 of the poorest countries around the world. And on the 4th of June, the UK will be hosting the Global Vaccine Summit to coordinate international investment efforts for Gavi. Together with the announcement made by the Prime Minister on Monday, that is a combined additional investment in global health security that comes to more than £2 billion, helping combat the spread of this disease. In investing globally, we are helping to protect our citizens, our families from future waves of infection, and therefore protecting our NHS. The global pandemic is one part of the challenge facing the world. DFID's immediate coronavirus response to date amounts to £744 million, but this is on top of our work to pivot much of our existing activity to provide health, humanitarian and economic support where it is needed most as part of our response to these crises. A health response that builds on the UK's long-standing record of supporting countries to prepare for and respond to large disease outbreaks, including as the third largest donor to the World Health Organization. Investing on the frontier of research into new rapid diagnostics and therapeutics that can detect and treat coronavirus. And working in partnership with Unilever, we've launched an innovative hand-washing campaign that will reach 1 billion people around the world, a major contribution to global sanitation and hygiene. With the support of British and international NGOs and advice from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, we will reach 1 in 7 people around the world with information on the most effective ways to stop the virus spreading and therefore to save lives. We are also working to reduce the global economic impact of the virus by preventing its spread, protecting both the UK public and the stability of our economy. Last month, the UK, together with other G20 countries, announced a commitment to suspend debt service payments to the poorest countries until the end of 2020. This will create up to $12 billion of additional fiscal space. DFID has also made available up to £150 million to the International Monetary Fund for debt relief. These measures will enable developing countries to direct greater domestic resources to their own healthcare efforts, helping prevent the virus from spreading around the world. So we are supporting developing country governments to make proportionate, evidence-based trade-offs between containing the virus and maintaining open trade, so that essential goods and services, including critical medical and food supplies, can continue to move around the world. That supports developing countries, but it also means that British consumers will get the vital goods that they need. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 is a global pandemic. It does not respect national borders. Individual efforts will only succeed as part of a global response. The UK has been playing and will continue to play a leading role in galvanising the most effective coordinated international action. In 2017, the scientific community in the UK proudly played a key role in the international response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. I am proud to update the House that we are doing so again. We are using British expertise and funding to demonstrate leadership internationally. Recognising that needs will be great, we are doing whatever it takes to make sure vaccines, treatments and technologies are available, to save lives and to support economies in the most vulnerable countries to help end the pandemic. This will help reduce the risk of the world being attacked by a second wave of infection. So as the Prime Minister said on Monday, it's humanity against the virus. We are in this together, and only together will we prevail. I commend this statement to the House.
I now call Pleat Cor Gill, who has 5 minutes to respond. Pleat Cor Gill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement, and I would also like to offer my thanks to all those workers, both in the UK and across the world, who are on the front line during this pandemic. In particular, I would like to thank the women who make up more than 70% of the global health workforce and who provide unpaid and underpaid care in communities around the world. Wherever you look, the virus has hit the poorest and most vulnerable hardest and has exacerbated existing inequalities. I'm sure she will agree with me that ensuring we have a strong, independent DFID is vital to overcoming the immediate emergency of the coronavirus while continuing to tackle global poverty, inequality, and the climate crisis. I support the Secretary of State's commitment to the pledging event on Monday, which was hosted by the European Union and other partners. I welcome the UK's commitment of £388 million. Can she tell the House how much of that announcement was new additional money? Without global collaboration, there is a risk of a scramble between countries, huge price hikes and restrictions on supply, which will all come at the expense of people's lives. So what steps is she taking to secure buy-in from those who did not attend the event or those who did not contribute, such as the United States and China? Following the comments from the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care about an upside of being first to discover a vaccine, has the Secretary of State explained to him that creating division and competition between nations will cost lives? Could she also detail the concrete conditions the government is attaching to public money going to researching and manufacturing tests, vaccines and medical tools for COVID-19, so that those who need access to this vital equipment and medicine, wherever they are in the world, are able to access it as quickly as possible. I would also like to take this opportunity to raise the issue of shipments and distribution. Since the week of March the 22nd, UNICEF has reported a 70 to 80% reduction in planned vaccine shipments. With a huge increase in the cost of flights to deliver goods, what steps is she taking to get medical supplies to countries that are running out and to stop airline companies profiteering from the global pandemic? I welcome the steps the IMF and G20 have taken so far on debt relief. The Jubilee Debt Campaign has estimated that bonds and other private external debt payments for 77 of the poorest countries totals at least 9.4 billion for May to December 2020. With the UK playing its part as a key jurisdiction for international debt contracts, can the Secretary of State explain what legislative options she is exploring to protect countries from being crippled by private debt? Coronavirus is not just a health emergency, but it's an economic and social one too. These secondary impacts of the coronavirus risk doing untold damage to people's lives. We are already seeing large-scale food insecurity, increases in deaths due to other health problems such as HIV and malaria, and the clamping down of human rights. The Secretary of State mentioned pivoting resources towards COVID-19. Does she agree with me that diverting resources risks seeing a spike in problems in other areas, as we have already seen in the United Kingdom? Finally, Mr. Speaker, as we saw during the Ebola outbreak, trusted organisations rooted in communities will be crucial to delivering accurate public health messaging and WASH projects which saves lives. There is no substitute for the unique experiences, relationships and specialisms of local and national civil society organisations, and these will be vital to tackling the global pandemic. The latest Bond survey found that 52% of small NGOs have had to cut back on programming working across the Global South, removing the life-saving work they do. And I am concerned by how little UK aid has gone to local organisations. So will the Secretary of State ensure that any new plan her department is involved in, including any revised UN Global Humanitarian Response Plan, contains a genuine commitment to scaling up a locally led approach, including women and girls' rights organisations, large and small NGOs, faith groups and trade unions? As ever, I'm here to support and assist. Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Lady for her questions. I will do my best to answer them all in turn. So, in relation to the funding allocation, we have obviously put forward so far and committed £276 million in terms of the resilience part with multilateral organisations and UN appeals alongside the International Red Cross, the Unilever project, and then 318 million focused in the vaccine, drugs and therapeutics space, both through CEPI, through FIND, through Welcome, and so on, alongside obviously the economic response with the IMF commitment of £150 million and the Gavi investment, which will be all part of the delivery of the vaccine. In relation to that, I wasn't aware of the UNICEF statistics she relates to in terms of the vaccine treatment numbers, so I will ask my officials to be in touch with her and have a look more closely at that. So I thank her for raising that with me today. The event on Monday was coordinated by the EU and co-hosted by a number of leaders, including our own Prime Minister. So it was a coalition of the willing. It was a gathering together of those mostly European nations who wanted to show their support and their solidarity on the international front. So the work that we're doing, working closely with the USA, both in vaccines and more widely about future delivery, continues separately. Their commitment is enormous, both internally and also, I was talking with the new USAID chief, John Barster, earlier in the week about how they are going to focus in that medium term, that substantial commitment the US always makes in supporting vulnerable countries. So that will be an ongoing conversation, and I think their commitment from USAID is unstinting in that space. A very important question which the Honourable Lady raised, Mr. Speaker, in the question of how the conditions go with the funding that we put in. That's why we have invested our funds through CEPI and through FIND. Both those organisations put their money into the appropriate projects with an understanding and a contractual relationship which ensures that those scientific programmes then are accessible to all. So it's a really important and secure way, if that's the right way to describe it, of making sure that that UK taxpayers' money really does reach to the vulnerable countries when the technologies are discovered. And I completely agree with her just on the question of food insecurity, Mr. Speaker. I think this is absolutely a critical question which we must not lose sight of as we are fighting this disease in the short term and getting to it. The impact on those most vulnerable countries of food insecurity absolutely has not gone away. The threat of the locust plagues just in one part of the globe is one critical function that we need to get on top of, and I think we are starting to see, as everyone looks up from their own domestic challenges, the great challenge that we have, that if we don't support all those other critical preventable death areas, we will find that we can't tackle this, and as I say before, no one is safe till we are all safe.
Mr. Gagan Mahindra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend for her statement. She will be aware of the World Health Organization, and there have been some criticisms. Do we agree with those criticisms, and are we reviewing the funding of the WHO?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for that question. It's a really important one, and I don't think anyone would suggest that WHO is a perfect organisation, but it is an extraordinary organisation because it has the legitimacy of pretty much every country on the planet. And it is a profoundly experienced and wise organisation in all matters health, and it has the ability to reach and to support every country around the globe. So we are one of its largest core funders, and we have been for many, many years. We continue to do that, and whilst there are always lessons to be learned, and no doubt, in something like a global pandemic, we will be in a whole new territory of lessons to be learned and understanding, where countries did well, where multilateral organisations were able to. The reality is that the WHO is that central point, that central hub, and we will continue to support it absolutely throughout the crisis and continue to work, as we have done in the past, to find ways to help it to become a slicker, more effective organisation in the future.
We go across to the SNP spokesperson, Chris Law. Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for advance cyber statement and welcome all measures taken to assist a multilateral international response to this crisis. The warnings by the impact of COVID-19 on the world's poorest and most vulnerable people have been clear. Uncontrolled spread of the virus in fragile states and within refugee camps, a famine of biblical proportions, and worldwide economic devastation, which will result in 30 years of the UK's international development work being undone. However, if we do not tackle COVID everywhere, then we face the prospect of infection also returning back to the UK in a mutated form. Therefore, what specific measures beyond aid is the government taking to ensure that we tackle COVID everywhere? For example, will postponing debt repayments for developing countries be extended beyond 2020 until we know what COVID has been eradicated? And will private creditors and multilateral institutions be included within this? Lastly, what specific provisions of public health expertise and medical equipment will be made to developing countries? And how will wide-scale vaccination programs be rolled out in countries in conflict, such as Yemen and Syria?